The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Okay, Scott Pruitt, he's the head of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. Ideologically, it's an agency that, if you don't take climate change that seriously, you probably don't take the work of the EPA that seriously, other than seeing it as a way to sort of try to get out of the way of business interests and let them do whatever the hell they want. But Scott Pruitt, in particular, has been sort of running the EPA in a way that's a little bit different than others. For example, he's the first head of the EPA to have full-time security. Okay, does the head of the EPA need full-time security? I don't know. Maybe if you are coming in and trying to take one of the most aggressively anti-science points of view of any recent EPA, people get mad and you justify needing 24-hour security. Okay, the latest news, about Scott Pruitt and the EPA is that he's having a custom $25,000 soundproof communications booth built at his office, at the office of the administrator of the EPA. So what's the justification? The justification is you need to be able to have secure communications. It's an age of cyber hacking and cybersecurity concerns, and so he needs to be protected from that. Okay, but even if you believe that, and even if you believe that the normal EPA offices are not protected enough from cyber hacking and cyber surveillance, a normal soundproof telecommunications booth is like $6,000 to $8,000. And the company that's been hired to do this has been building these for government agencies for a long time. They said, well, this particular soundproof communications booth is costing $25,000 because Scott Pruitt and the EPA wanted it extra customized. The company is Acoustical Solutions in Richmond, Virginia. And they are building, they needed to go to the manufacturer for a totally custom solution. This might not actually be indicative of any wrongdoing, but when you're already seen as the most secretive EPA, a sketchy EPA, an EPA which may not even really be directed by someone who values the mission of the EPA, then you add 24/7 security and a $25,000 custom telecommunications booth. It doesn't look good.
And it's also just piling on with the expenditures of other members of the Trump administration. Like we've learned about Tom Price and his chartering of private jets. We've learned about Steve Mnuchin wanting to take a government plane to Europe for his honeymoon and took one to Kentucky just to see the solar eclipse.
Yep.
So we're seeing this. I mean, it's Trump came in saying he was supposed to drain the swamp, but this is the swampiest of swamps we've ever seen.
Oh yeah, I mean, you've got the person running the Department of Energy who just a few years ago said he didn't think the Department of Energy should exist. You've got Scott Pruitt running the EPA, which is there to use regulatory power to protect the environment, and it's not even clear he believes that the environment needs to be protected, never mind through government regulation. So this is, again, it's one of those optic stories where in and of itself, it doesn't necessarily change the dynamic at the EPA, which is terrible, by the way, given what they're doing around climate research. But you'd think someone might say, well, maybe this isn't going to look good. But if there's a silver lining here, it's that they don't seem to care about optics.
Well, it's interesting in Pruitt's case because he's not one of the richest members of Trump's cabinet. He's maybe worth like $1 to $5 million in net worth, total assets and all that, which isn't that much comparatively. And we've seen, from the richest members of his cabinet, maybe like Wilbur Ross, Rex Tillerson, I guess it makes more sense for them to splurge on this kind of thing because they're used to that. That's their lifestyle.
Yeah.
They've had jobs where they've had perks like this. But maybe Scott Pruitt goes into this position and he's on top of the world and he thinks he can spend all this money. Maybe.
Well, when you know that the guy at the top, Donald Trump, has basically a philosophy of greed, personal enrichment, and delusions of grandeur, it's going to filter down. So if you're one of the rich people in Trump's cabinet, you're going to continue the lavish stuff because it's what you're used to. And if you're one of the slightly less rich people in Trump's cabinet, you're going to see it as an opportunity to start living the lavish life that people like Wilbur Ross and whoever else are living, right? It all comes down from the top. It's the philosophy we see from Trump.
And this sound booth is more necessary for someone recording an EP rather than someone running the EPA?
Yes, I like that. EP versus EPA. Very, very clever. Okay. Agro-biodiversity. What is agro-biodiversity? This is a new index that has been created to try to sort of identify the level of food diversity that a community, country, or area has. So this issue of food diversity, it actually relates all the way back to when humans stopped being hunter-gatherers and established agriculture for the first time. So before the advent of human agriculture, people ate a much more varied diet. 7,000 is the estimate. 7,000 different, I guess we would call them species, right, of plant and animal. Most of them were plant, right? There weren't actually, the number of different animals people ate tended to be smaller because it was often determined sort of geographically, like what's in that area that you can actually catch. Whereas edible plant species, when you consider that you're in more of a nomadic hunter-gatherer sort of mode, you're eating a lot of different plant species, 7,000 by some estimates. Then came agriculture. And agriculture, when you actually started growing a particular crop in large quantities tied to a geographical location, you became increasingly dependent on that one crop. And that's why agriculture had its pros and cons, cons being if that one crop experienced blight of some kind, then you could have an entire community that's built around that agricultural land die partially or really struggle. But also, it generally reduced the amount of variety in everybody's diet, because when you get way more calories from one crop, you're probably cutting out lots of other sources of calories. And this is a risk factor. If you're evaluating an area, country, population's risk factor when it comes to food supply, lower diversity in diets increases susceptibility to supply shocks or droughts or rising temperatures or whatever. So what does this get us to? The European Commission has funded or founded, I guess we would say, the Agro-Biodiversity Index. It's expected to launch late next year. It'll include some concrete criteria for measuring the level of agro-biodiversity, and it'll be a useful thing. You can then, if you believe in market solutions to something like poverty or food diversity, you can then create incentives that are tied to agro-biodiversity. So for example, you could reduce tariffs on food trade that would increase agro-biodiversity to a region, for example. You could figure out ways to add a financial component to this. But as a concept, I think it's a really interesting concept. And many people don't realize how few people think, well, I'm eating all these different vegetables, and sometimes I have Japanese, and sometimes I have pizza, whatever else. Most people, in terms of the real, like the source materials that are in their food, it's narrower than most people understand.
Yeah, and I think that's why people think that this diversification could help fight malnutrition too, because these little known plants, I guess that there's some examples like quinoa.
Quinoa, it's a type of grain.
Yeah, it's similar to quinoa or comparable in some way.
But I guess
it's apparently much more nutritious.
And frost resistant, I guess. So you can grow it in more places than quinoa? Or?
And then the other example I saw were To'o bananas. It's spelled T-O''O.
Yeah.
And apparently they have a lot more vitamin A than the Cavendish variety.
Right. Cavendish people, I actually read once about bananas. And we don't really know. We're just like, it's a banana. The standard banana that we eat, I have one over on my desk, is a Cavendish banana.
Wow.
Yeah, most people don't know that.
That's probably the Ray Comfort banana.
And when I say most people don't know that, I'm not saying it like when Trump says it, which is, I didn't know it 2 minutes ago, but now I do. But most other people actually do. I only learned about Cavendish bananas, and I've mentioned it to a few people over the last few years, and nobody knew that the banana we eat, the modern banana, is a Cavendish. Now, what I don't know is, are plantains, which are sort of like a firmer banana-like fruit that's often used for slicing up and sautéing, or a cooked banana type application, is that also under the umbrella of a Cavendish, or is that a totally different product altogether?
That's the idea for our next long-form piece, I think.
Yeah, we're going to do a deep dive into banana species. So anyway, agro-biodiversity, it's an interesting concept. It could help deal with hunger. It's a great thing, but it will also be used to make money, because you can always connect it to financial incentives.
Right. I think we have to see what the economic incentives are going to be, if they're going to reduce tariffs or what have you, because just coming out with an index alone isn't going to do much, especially because we see companies are mostly incentivized by a profit motive more than anything else.
The companies that are supplying the food are still mostly for-profit companies, so it's great to have an index, and academicians will be able to do all sorts of interesting research, but how will it actually apply to solving the food supply, food desert issues that we have? So earlier this week, we told you that in the Alabama senatorial Republican primary, Tuesday, Luther Strange, which was Trump's guy, was defeated by equally or more nutty candidate Roy Moore. We've talked about Roy Moore many times on the program over the years. And there's an interesting piece that just outlines 7 of the craziest things that Roy Moore has said. The most recent one was where he referred to Native Americans and Asian people as reds and yellows. And what's just hilarious about that is it was a speech where he was sort of trying to call for more unity. And he referred to 2 groups by pejorative names that had been developed hundreds of years ago, mostly by white settlers or colonialists. That's not exactly the way it's like showing up at a black church and using the N-word to try to bring everybody together if you're Roy Moore. It doesn't really make any sense.
And their disaster response was to say that it was just taken out of context. But you could watch the whole video and you understand that it was completely in context.
There's no more than 15 seconds on each side that even relate to the context. Like there was no really other context than that. Okay. Vladimir Putin, as we know, opposed to gay marriage. Once Roy Moore told The Guardian that maybe Putin is right in terms of his opposition to gay marriage. All right, if you're against gay marriage, there are also other people you can agree with other than Vladimir Putin, which might not be as controversial. He once said he was informed. By whom? We don't know. What communities? It's not clear. But he claimed that he was informed that there are American communities living under Sharia law. Wow, that would be a big deal because Sharia law is not the legal system. And then he once expanded on that a little bit by saying up in Illinois, Christian communities, I don't know if they may be Muslim communities, but Sharia law is a little different from American law. It is founded on religious concepts and totally unintelligible on this issue, but claiming that there are parts of the U.S. living under Sharia law.
Right, he starts to define Sharia law, which wasn't really the claim that he was making.
No.
Right? Very strange.
Yeah, very, very
People are telling me.
Weird road to go down. He once asked, what is a dreamer? Quit beating around and tell me what it is. This was in a July radio interview, and it's so funny. Dreamers, of course, are the children of individuals who came to the United States undocumented and are here in the United States through no fault of their own in the sense that they were not legally adults when their parents brought them to the U.S. So it seemed from this radio interview that he thought dreamer was a colloquial term that maybe the left had applied to people who have dreams of making it in the United States or something. It very specifically refers to children of undocumented immigrants who came to the United States. And he sort of called out the term dreamers in this radio interview. You're running for Senate of the United States, by the way, in Alabama, which it doesn't really share a border with Mexico, but it is close to the U.S.-Mexico border. And he writes off the term dreamers like it's just some kind of general idea, the idea of a dreamer.
I mean, it is on the Gulf of Mexico, so maybe he should know. And also, he was a former judge, too. You'd think that a judge would be aware of what DACA is.
Yeah, and apparently he wasn't aware. Roy Moore once said that 9/11 might have happened because we've distanced ourselves from God. I don't think I need to go too much further. That one kind of speaks for itself. He once stated his personal belief that President Obama was not born in the United States of America, a birther, so in a sense he would fit right in with the Trump crowd. And lastly, he once said that Muslim Congressman Keith Ellison should be prohibited from taking the congressional oath, that Islamic law is simply incompatible with our law. And of course, even though you do swear on a Bible when you're sworn in, unless you opt not to, and Keith Ellison didn't because he's not Christian, really, there should be total separation of church and state. So actually, there should be it should be irrelevant what someone's personal religion is because it shouldn't be playing a role in their job as public officials. But with Roy Moore, First Amendment only protects Christians.
Right.
Christianity perfectly fine being connected to being a judge or congressman or senator or whatever. But Keith Ellison as a Muslim? Oh, no, no, no. Despite the fact that the Constitution says we are not going to discriminate against others on the basis of their religious beliefs.
Right. I mean, maybe he just thinks that the First Amendment applies only to Christians in the sense that you could be free to be a Catholic or a Presbyterian or a Southern Baptist
or Pentecostal.
I mean, it goes further than that.
Any type of Christianity is fine according to the First Amendment. Total freedom for whatever version of Christianity you believe.
Even the Mormons.
Yes. Well,
we don't know.
I never totally figure out who are Mormons are. I believe that Mormons are Christians because they follow Jesus.
The Church of Latter-day Saints.
Yeah, but there are still those who say, and I don't really care about this, but there are people who say Mormons aren't really Christians. But it's like, I don't even care to argue with you. I don't care enough about it to argue with you. But anyway, I think they do consider themselves Christians by and large. That's it for the bonus show. We will talk to you tomorrow.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.